3D games. No, not that 3D. I'm talking about this kind of 3D. We've come a long way, haven't we? But at the time, this was considered pretty cool. A lot of people nowadays will tell you that the 2D sprite-based games that came before it have aged much better visually, and yeah, I'm one of those people. You gotta remember though, at the time this was a completely new look for games, and with that came excitement, if for no other reason than what it meant for how games would play going forward. I mean, Super Mario 64 was a completely fresh new experience compared to Super Mario World. All of a sudden, player movement was far less limited, and you were no longer restricted to moving just left or right. However crude these primitive 3D visuals might look today, the industry decided at the time they couldn't just have another console generation that focused on 2D. 3D was new and exciting, and the technology was finally there for developers to make games in ways that weren't possible before. I understand why it happened, but a part of me can't help but think how cool it would have been to have another console generation focused on 2D. Symphony of the Night is that one 2D game from a major developer that I always go back to when I think about this. Would we have gotten a bunch of amazing games like that? Just think how a sprite-based Contra game could have looked and played if made from the ground up for the Saturn or PlayStation. It's hard for me not to think there was still some potential for 2D games that was left untapped, and it would have been really cool to see it. But nope, things went 3D with mixed results. I think of it as the growing pains of the industry. Developers had to start making 3D games at some point for the growth to start. It makes sense that this initial transition would be a challenge, so much so that it's considered an accomplishment to make this transition, with games like Super Mario 64 and Metal Gear Solid being great examples. I can't help but think that certain games just weren't meant to be in 3D. You often have to reinvent a game to make this transition well. Just look at how much trouble this has caused for Sonic over the years, to the point that arguably the best Sonic game made since the original games is a game that tries to be like the originals. In fact, we've seen a lot of indie developers and even some of the bigger publishers, albeit more rarely, go back to 2D visuals because they realized, hey, this looks great, and is easier to make in some ways. I actually kind of look forward to a day where things have gone as far as they can go in the 3D space, to the point where trying to make games look even more realistic is no longer viable, and instead we get stuff that just looks cool, like Zelda here, or even just good old pixel art games made by huge studios with a ton of resources. I think games that are pixel-based or use a unique art style have aged better. I mean, just look at how poorly the visuals of early 3D games have fared. Don't get me wrong, I actually love a lot of these games, but it's hard to argue this looks amazing now, and I think the games from this generation are the ones that fare the best from being visually improved in an updated release. One thing I should mention though, is how these early 3D games might look even worse than they have to, due to how people are hooking these consoles up to their TV. These consoles are meant for older TVs, like the one I'm using here. Just think about it. You're taking composite video, which is a blurry video signal to begin with, and plugging it into a massive high-definition television. And what are you feeding into it? Oh, just a console with primitive 3D graphics that runs at a standard definition resolution and stretching that resolution out to fit on a TV meant for high definition. And to make it even worse, often without even realizing it, some people will stretch games out into a widescreen aspect ratio that weren't meant for it, further distorting the image. And yes, I'm one of those people who notices that kind of stuff, but I try not to point it out to people as if it makes them a bad person. I feel like the 3D visuals of games really started to look reasonable with consoles like the Dreamcast, GameCube, and so on. This is when it became much more clear what was being represented on screen. I was actually recently playing my PS1 for a long period of time, and followed it up immediately by playing a GameCube game, which was actually a Dreamcast game, and the difference blew me away. It's a pretty noticeable improvement in my opinion. However, no matter how much these visuals improve, I think I'll always prefer 2D games. Now, if given the choice for games to have never transitioned to 3D, would I have chosen that? Definitely not. I may not like 3D games as much as 2D games overall, but I do still like them a lot and appreciate the variety they've added to video games. Heck, my favorite game of all time is a 3D game, which funny enough is also in the other kind of 3D now. Because of this, I know to always be open to new games and the ideas that may come with them. I want to see the video game medium do well, and the more diversity there is, the better. So there you have it, and that about does it for this video. I'd like to ask you all what your preference is between 2D or 3D games. Do you have one, or maybe you don't even care that much and just see a good game as a good game, regardless of how it looks? So let us know in the comments, and I will see ya in the next video.